I'm David Patterson. I'm with the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies here at UT Dallas. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you this year's Einspruch lecturer. It's my great pleasure to thank Burton Einspruch, who is here this morning, for making this possible. I'm glad you can hear me. Is this on? Anyway, welcome to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Einspruch, for your support for this lecture series at the Ackerman Center. I'd like to welcome also my friend and colleague Marcy Littell, who has worked with us on the annual Scholars Conference that you all know about, which happens in March. Peter Hayes, our guest today, is a world-renowned scholar, a world-class scholar, without exaggeration, like other Einspruch lecturers, and he is sustaining that tradition here for us. He is an emeritus professor, the Theodore Zev Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation Professor of Holocaust Studies at Northwestern University. He has authored and edited a dozen books. The award-winning Industry and Ideology, I.G. Farben and the Nazi Era. He has edited several important collections from the Lessons and Legacies biannual conferences, the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies. How Was It Possible? A Holocaust Reader. Some of you heard his outstanding, amazing lecture yesterday on his most recent book, Why? Explaining the Holocaust, and he's currently turning out yet another book called Prophets and Persecution, German Big Business in the Third Reich. I always like to point out not only the profound scholarship and research contributions that someone like Peter Hayes has made, but also the fact that he has an extremely impressive record of being recognized for his excellence in teaching. He's the winner of Northwestern University's highest honor for teaching, the Charles Deering McCormick Professorship of Teaching Excellence. It doesn't always happen that an incredible scholar is also an incredible teacher. And I think you'll find out this morning what a wonderful teacher Peter Hayes is. And let me just mention one last thing, just so we can have the joy of hearing Peter. He just won the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's National Leadership Award. So he comes well-credentialed, well-honored, well-known, and let's make sure he's very welcome here. Welcome, Peter.
And this morning, probably my most distinctive credential is I'm an ardent Red Sox fan. So I had a very good night last night. Thank you all for coming. My subject this morning has been treated with a great many sensationalist accounts. There are a number of books that have been written explaining supposed pacts or alliances between German corporations and the Nazi state, and the involvement of German corporations in the crimes of the Holocaust. Most of these books, including a number of bestsellers, are remarkably superficial. However sinister the consequences of the association of German big business with the Nazi state, the origins were extremely complex. They were not as simple as corporate executives deciding that they were going to be participants in mass murder. And this morning what I want to try to do is take you through some of those complexities so that we can see how this was possible. Because most of the nation's leading corporations and most of the subsidiaries of corporations headquartered abroad that had branches in Germany did become deeply implicated in the crimes of the Nazi state. I want to take a rather odd point of beginning for a lecture that deals with capitalist organizations. I want to read you a citation from Karl Marx. In the a pamphlet that he wrote, one of his most famous, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Marx famously wrote, quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past," unquote. Now let me translate that quotation into something to do with corporations. It would read something like this: corporations seek to make money, but they do not make it just as they please, but under circumstances directly encountered, both given and inherited. Now, among the inherited conditions are the strategic reflexes that firms have developed, strategies, approaches to the market, plans for how they will prosper. And the given conditions include those created by their political environments. I want to suggest to you today that the interplay of these two conditions, I'm in a business school, so I have to talk a little jargon now. Okay? The interplay of these two conditions, one internal and microeconomic, if you will, the strategies that firms develop and so on, and the other external and macroeconomic, the political conditions in which firms find themselves. The interplay of these things goes a long way toward explaining the increasing complicity of German enterprise with the crimes of the Nazi regime. Now, in the jargon of the trade, what happened was optimization in the context of monopsony. See, just being able to utter that sentence, my salary should go up by about 20%. Because I'm no longer in the history department, I'm in the business school. I should make more money. What is monopsony? Everybody knows what monopoly is, right? Monopoly is dependence on a single seller. The whole market is dominated by a single seller. Almost nobody has ever heard this word, monopsony. It is when a market is dependent on a single buyer. When one buyer controls the future of any enterprise trying to make money in the field. Okay? Now, this is an absolutely vital term for understanding the Nazi economy, because the Nazi economy was not a socialist economy in which the means of production are nationalized and the state controls the economy directly in that fashion, through ownership. But it was an economy that was dominated by the state, not as owner, but as purchaser. From 1933 to 1939, the Nazi state carried out the fastest and most extensive industrial recovery in the Western world. Full employment was restored, gross national product exceeded the previous high levels of 1928, the Depression was wiped out. How did they do it? They did it with a program that historians have called militarized Keynesianism. They did it, in a sense, it was a recovery fueled by public expenditure, government spending, so Keynesian in the sense that it put money into the economy, but it did not put money in the pockets of consumers and thus lead to a revival of the economy through the demand function. It put money into the producers of goods that the Nazi state thought would be vital for victory in a coming war. And these were two kinds of goods: armaments, okay, cannon, guns, tanks, butter, so on, those things. And then secondly, substitutes for imported raw materials. Hitler believed that Germany had lost the First World War because it had been blockaded. The British Navy had prevented the inflow of goods. The chaos in Russia had reduced the supply of food to the country, and therefore Germany was starved out. He swore that that would never happen again. And the way for Germany to be prepared for victory in another coming war, which would reverse the outcome of the first one, was for it to have the capacity to produce everything it needed from its own resources. Germany is a resource-poor country. It does not have oil. It does not have all of the things that we associate with modern industry, with one exception. What it does have is coal, water, wood, earth, and air. And the German chemical industry, which is what I'm going to concentrate on in a minute, was a master at turning those things into substitutes for imported raw materials. The Nazis poured their budget. 67% of the growth in the German gross national product between 1933 and 1939 came from government expenditures on armaments and self-sufficiency, what was called autarky in those days. All right? Now, this is the economic context in which corporations find themselves from the time Hitler acquired power in 1933 until the outbreak of the Second World War, and then they still find themselves in this situation under wartime conditions, only they're slightly changed. Businesses engage in, the other fancy word I used a few minutes ago, engage in optimization. What does that mean? Extracting the most possible income out of the markets and conditions that are available to you. You optimize what your firm does in order to achieve results. If the context is monopsony, the state is increasingly the dominant buyer in the society. The state controls, and this is what the Nazis did do, the states controlled whether you get labor, whether you get steel, whether you get concrete. If you are a producer in, I don't know, Bielefeld of candy, and you decide you want to expand your production of candy, you are dependent in the Nazi state on a host of approvals. Will I get steel to make the assembly line that produces the candy? Can I buy the machine tools that are required? If the cocoa has to be imported, can I get foreign currency to buy the cocoa? Because you have to have what's called foreign exchange, dollars, gold, the money of the country that you're buying it from in order to buy that stuff. All of that was dependent on government approval. Firms quickly adapted to that context, quickly recognized if we are going to operate at all under this context, in this context, we have to play by the rules. Now, I used to explain to people that the Nazis created what was called a Skinner box economy. But then I realized that I'm old and that people used to know in the 1960s what a Skinner box is, but almost nobody knows anymore. This is like yesterday I used the phrase fifth column, and I said, how many people know what a fifth column is? And most of the people in the room who are over 40 raised their hands, and most of the people in the room who are under 40 looked sheepish. Fifth column is a phrase drawn from the Spanish Civil War. In 1936 to 39, if you were born like I was in 1946, this was yesterday's news. You knew what a fifth column was. But if you were born in 1996, who has any idea what a fifth column is? Skinner box is another one of these things. Skinner was a behavioral psychologist, and he studied conditioning in animals. And he taught pigeons. He put pigeons in a box, and he taught them that when a light went on, they should peck a little button. And if they did that, a pellet of food dropped. And they learned the light means I peck, means I get food. This is a simple conditioning experiment to make animals do things in repetitive fashion. The Nazi economy was a Skinner box economy. The cues were sent out from the center. This is what we want. And if people responded to the cues, they got what they wanted, which was revenue, which was profit. And if they didn't respond, or they couldn't respond because they didn't have what the Nazis were after, they fell by the wayside. A system of rewards and punishments. What were the rewards? If you built the kind of factory and produced the kinds of goods that the Nazi state wanted you to produce, you got government contracts to buy what you made at a guaranteed profit of 5% on your investment, depreciation of your factory at 10% a year for 10 years, you follow? And a government promise to buy everything you can produce. This is a bonanza. And this is the way in which the Nazis set up the economy. Now, if you understand this, you have a sense of what the reward structure was in which corporations reacted to stimuli, and they were always had in the back of their mind that if we don't respond to these stimuli in the way that will be productive, they can always find another company to do it. Or in the Nazi state, what could happen and did happen is the Nazi state could say, none of you want to do this? You don't want to produce the Volkswagen, the people's car, at $1,000 a pop? You think that's not economical? We can found a company to do that. We can give it money that we have, in the case of the Volkswagen, money that we have seized when we took all the property of the trade unions. And we can fund that new company with this money that we stole. Still don't want to sell the car? We'll undersell you. So this was, the Nazis played on competitive impulses, either existing firms competing against each other, or the promise that they could found new firms that would compete against them and so on. So this is the environment in which German business operated. This isn't to exonerate the leaders of these companies, but there's something quite striking about the two companies I'm going to concentrate on for the next few minutes. I've written books about these two companies. One is called IG Farben. That stands for Interessengemeinschaft der Farbenindustrie, the interest community of the dye industry, of the colors industry. Okay? These are organic, this is an organic chemicals firm, chemicals rooted in carbon, that was a merger in 1925 of a series of different German chemicals firms, many of whose names you now know, because after 1945 the company was broken up. It went back into some of the original parts. You all know Bayer, in this country Bayer, aspirin. This was the company that invented aspirin in the 1890s. It was called Bayer until 1925 when it disappeared into IG Farben. You probably all know BASF, Badische Anilin- und Sodafabrik. That also was a company that existed before 1925, disappeared into IG Farben, emerged from IG Farben after the war. In the days when we didn't have iPhones and people used photographic film, everybody knew Agfa. That also was a member of IG Farben. Okay, when this company was merged in 1925, it was the largest chemicals company in the world. It was the fourth largest corporation on the globe, as measured by stock value, by number of employees, and so on and so forth. The other company is Degussa. This is an acronym. You can follow the bouncing ball. Deutsche Gold und Silber Scheider Anstalt. German Gold and Silver Separation Institute. Precious metals firm. Producer of inorganic chemicals, because inorganic chemicals are needed to separate ores from rock. And this was so they did a lot of sodium and potassium and so forth. Now these two companies, one of the interesting things about them is in 1933, there was not, when Hitler came to power, there was not a single National Socialist on either firm's board of directors. German companies have two boards of directors. In America, we have internal directors and external directors. In German companies, those are separate. There are two boards. There's a managing board, which is the managers within the company responsible for the divisions who operate the place. And there's a supervisory board, which is often people who used to work for the company or bankers and so forth, people from outside, and they supervise the work of the managing board. Now, in case of IG Farben, in 1933, that's over 40 people, not a single Nazi. In the case of Degussa in 1933, it's about 15 people, not a single Nazi. The two, for IG Farben had made one financial contribution to the Nazi Party in the summer of 1932, and then in the fall elections of 1932 had not repeated that. And it was a relatively small donation. Degussa had, some managers of Degussa had contributed to the Nazi Party, but the firm never had. Neither firm had ever advertised in Nazi newspapers, which was another way of supporting the party before it came to power. And the explanation for this is that as far as these companies could tell in advance, Nazi economics was not likely to be good for them. They both did a lot of business overseas, exports. They feared that the Nazis, who were a kind of protectionist party, they wanted to raise tariffs, they wanted to reduce imports, that would be bad for their business abroad and so forth. So the calculation was, on the economic side, we don't trust these people, and on the political side, look who they are. I mean, Adolf Hitler never went to college. These people he's never been in the government. He doesn't have the experience to run the country. So these were people who were mistrustful of the Nazi movement, 1933. Flash forward to 1943. They are both deeply involved in the most heinous crime of the Holocaust because they are co-owners of the company that holds the patent rights to a product called Zyklon, which was the gas used primarily at Auschwitz, but also at Majdanek, to murder people. They own, it's very complicated because there are two production firms for Zyklon. Then there is the patent holder for, Zyklon is hydrocyanic acid. It is put in which is a liquid. It is very unstable. If you move it around, it tends to blow up. So the Zyklon was a product that allowed for the absorption of the liquid into pellets, and the pellets could be packed in a vacuum can and moved all over the place. And then when you open that can, it vaporizes in mixing with oxygen and kills people. What Degussa did is it patented the thing that absorbed the gas. And it had a subsidiary named Degesh, which also held patent rights on the formula that made the gas. And then there were two sales companies that sold this stuff, one to civilians and one to the military generally, okay? So it's a complicated structure. But 1943, these two firms are the co-owners of the patent holder. The operations of the whole thing are led out of an office in Degussa's headquarters in Frankfurt. And the head of that headquarters knows what the gas is being used for. And the head of the sales company that sells to the SS also knows. So 10 years later, they are deeply implicated in the murder process. They are also both using slave laborers. And they are using them in locations very near each other. IG Farben built what was supposed to be the biggest chemicals factory in Europe, about 3.5 miles east of Auschwitz, and did it in part with the construction laborer of inmates of the camp who were periodically sent out to help in the building, and when they were so weak or emaciated, they were sent back, gassed, and replaced. And the leaders of IG Farben knew this because there was a subcamp established on the site of the factory after a while for the workers who did the construction work. And the IG Farben managers knew what the attrition rate was at this, how many were going back, how many were being reordered, and so on and so forth. 20 miles up the road from Auschwitz, in a town called Gleiwitz, this company, Degussa, was building a factory to make a complementary material. The factory at Auschwitz was primarily dedicated to producing synthetic rubber. The factory at Gleiwitz by Degussa was primarily dedicated to producing something called carbon black. You know, I was a history major. My chemical knowledge before I started doing this was virtually nil. And when somebody said to me carbon black, I said, well, that sounds sort of redundant. And somebody explained to me, oh no, there's something called carbon white. And I said, well, anyway, carbon black is a kind of soot. And it is absolutely vital, it's absolutely present. If this is another one where, you know, the world divides at the age of about 45. Groucho Marx used to say it's a common household product that you see around the house every day, right? You have all seen carbon black this morning. If you came here in an automobile, you were in close proximity to carbon black. Carbon black is an additive that is added to all rubber tires to this day. And what it does is it increases the durability of rubber. So IG Farben was making synthetic rubber at the Auschwitz plant, which is being built with slave labor, and Degussa was making a plant 20 miles up the road to produce the additive that makes the rubber more durable. Again, this is 10 years later. No Nazis, and now they're doing this. What's more, remember the name? Deutsche Gold und Silver Separation Institute. This is the company that processed all of the stolen precious metals in Nazi Europe that were turned into either bars that could be sent to Switzerland to buy things, or could be used in industrial products. And included among that during the Second World War were 5 metric tons of pure gold refined out of things stolen from Jews, and 100 metric tons of pure silver refined out of artifacts stolen from Jews. Now that includes everything from Torah scroll covers, they're taken out of synagogues and so forth, to the fillings ripped out of people's mouths after they had been gassed. So this is the extent of involvement, and you can go on. You know, they're both absolutely vital in making important military products without which the Reich could not have fought the Second World War, notably rubber. Okay? So how does that happen? How do you go from 1933, where none of them are Nazis, where they are not identified with the economic program of the Nazis, where they are, but there's no sign that they're enthusiastic about the coming Third Reich, and 10 years later, they are doing the work of the Third Reich. They are instrumental in the worst things the Nazis want to do. How do you explain that? Now, one way of explaining it is by saying, okay, you know, they become fervent Nazis. But that's probably, as far as I can tell, because I got in, first place, let me tell you a little bit about how I know about these things. IG Farben was broken up after the war, and 23 members of its board of directors were put on trial by the American occupation. That means that we seized enormous amounts of their archives that were still left in their headquarters in Frankfurt. And those became part of the American National Archives. So what I, if I had known in advance, would never have done, but what I decided to write my dissertation on when I was doing my PhD was this body of archival record. And there were 16,000 documents that were used in the trial, and then there were tens of thousands of documents that were piled up elsewhere and never used. So that's the first body of evidence. And going through all of that, one finds that when the war years roll around, there is some record of enthusiasm for the Nazi movement politically, but it takes a very long time to build. And there is some record of leading figures in this company articulating anti-Semitic sentiments. But they're people who came to the top during the Nazi era. They're not the people who were there in the first place, who ran the company originally. In the case of Degussa, what's remarkable is in the 1990s, the record is a little different. In the 1990s, the role of Degussa in processing the precious metals and in dealing and in using slave laborers became public knowledge. The World Jewish Congress rediscovered some of this information. They launched what is called a class action suit in an American court in New Jersey. A class action suit is an activity on the part of a group of people who have something in common. They're the class. And they file suit in the United States to obtain restitution for the crimes they allege from the assets of companies in the United States. Degussa, meanwhile, had established in the post-war era multiple branches in America. So had Bayer. So the suit was, we want restitution for the role in stealing the gold and the silver, the role in exploiting slave laborers who were not paid, right? Degussa and IG Farben paid the SS for the slave laborers, but they didn't pay the slave laborers. So this was the allegations, and this came up in the public, in the newspapers and so forth, and the leaders of Degussa were naturally, IG Farben, meanwhile, no longer existed. It had been split up, so it was just Bayer and BASF, and they weren't as visible, but Degussa was highly visible. And the directors of Degussa basically decided they had to do something to handle these allegations. Since none of them, remember this is the 1990s, and we're talking about events that happened more than 50 years earlier, none of them were the same people who'd been involved in the original crimes. They weren't even the children of the same people. So they were hit with these allegations, and they didn't know their own history. They had no idea, what did we really do? And they reacted the way corporate executives often react when they have a new challenge. They thought of calling in a consultant. But of course, this is a problem of history. So thank heaven, they didn't think that McKinsey and Company was the right address. They decided you get a historian, somebody who has a record of knowing his way or her way around this stuff, and you call that person in and you say, work your way through the sources. And so they contacted me because I had written about I.G. Farben, and because back in the 80s when I was working on a small project, I had actually visited their archive. I knew they had an archive. And it turned out they had a marvelous archive, an enormously extensive archive. It included personal diaries of the people who were on the managing board. It included memos that the leader of the company in 1933 to 37 had written for his nieces and nephews because he wanted to explain to them, now listen to this very carefully because it sounds funny. He wanted to, odd. He wanted to explain to his nieces and nephews, remember he's writing 1933 to 37, why he had been so foolish not to back Adolf Hitler before 1933. Now you see what kind of a document that is? That's not somebody after the war pushing the blame away saying, oh, I was against Hitler and so on and so forth. This is somebody in the middle of the whole thing who thinks it's working, who wants to inform his nieces and nephews why he didn't see the wonderful days that were coming. So this is the kind of source material I didn't have with I.G. Farben. I had all this internal stuff of the thought processes of these people, and I accepted the assignment and spent the better part of 3 years going back and forth, but as soon as the teaching term was over, to go over to Frankfurt and immerse myself in the archive for as long as I could and come back and so forth. So this is how I know what I'm going to try to argue to you, that I had extensive documentary collections out of the time. And now I want to try to answer for you the question, how do you get from there to there? How do you get from 1933, no implication, suspicion, so on, to 1943, full throttle support of the worst crimes of the Nazi state? What it really has to do with is the way in which, remember the Marx quote? The way in which circumstances directly encountered, both given and inherited, determined what the firms would do. Now, I'm not very good at visual aids, but the answer with regard to I.G. Farben is right here. I can go home now? It's all self-evident? All right. I.G. Farben is this massive company, and it lived and became massive through a succession of what we called product cycles. It was a company that lived off of R&D. And the R&D, the specialization was, we will invest, we're a big company, so we will invest huge amounts of money in perfecting the next substitute for things we used to import. And we'll make all those substitutes out of the one thing we have in Germany in superabundance, coal. This is not cheap, but what they did, and this it starts in a rather amusing fashion, what they did just before, in the early decade of the 20th century, first decade of the 20th century, they invested huge amounts of money in synthesizing indigo. Remember, this starts as a dye company. And this is an era in which workmen's clothes are often made out of blue jean material and so forth. Indigo comes normally from a plant. You derive the color from a plant. That means the supply of indigo is finite. However many acres you can plant with this stuff and how much of the sap will come out, that's all the indigo you have in the world. And what I.G. Farben learned to do was to make indigo out of coal. Don't ask me how you get from black to blue. But if you remember what aspirin, a lovely little white tablet of aspirin, you know what the starting material for that is? Coal tar. So it can be done. You see it every day in your medicine chest, all right? So what they did is they learned to synthesize indigo out of coal, and that meant that what you're seeing here are their profit curves. Because at first, you've invested a ton of money in this, and you are behind, you're negative, you're at a deficit. But once you've done it, you're the only company in the world that can do this, and you can undersell the natural product because the supply of coal is infinite. And the process can be refined steadily. So this is their profit curve. As they develop this, they get huge returns on indigo. Now, sooner or later, other companies begin to figure out how to imitate that, and the profit curve goes down. But meanwhile, you take this money and you stick it into the next curve. And the next thing they went after was nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is the basic product for fertilizers and explosives. And before World War I, before 1912, when they learned how to extract nitrogen out of the air we are breathing, what happens is it's under enormous heat and pressure in a chemical apparatus. You can extract nitrogen out of the air, and it comes out in the form of ammonia. It liquefies and comes out in the form of ammonia. Once you've done that, you have released the world from the dependence on other supplies for fertilizers. You know what it used to be? Guano. It used to be basically bird feces collected off islands on the west side of South America, or animal feces out of the fields. Now, once you've done that, again, you've repeated the phenomenon. The supply expands hugely, the price falls, and you're the only one doing it. So once again, there's enormous returns. You got this? Then in the 1920s, more people, other companies abroad and at home learn how to do this. Your returns decline, but meanwhile, you've got a ton of money that you've earned from this, and you put it into the next thing. The next thing was fuel, gas, gasoline. Benzene in German. You turn coal into fuel, and you no longer have to pay obeisance to Saudi Arabia, to put it in contemporary context. Okay? You're no longer dependent, and of course in those days, you're no longer dependent on the United States because we were a leading oil producer in that era. Now, I'm telling you all of this because here's what happens. If we had to draw a moment when Hitler comes to power in this story, it's sort of here. They have sunk a ton of money. This is declining. They've sunk a ton of money into this, hoping it will rise, and the Depression intervenes. The Depression comes in 1929, slows the pace of motorization in Germany, reduces the demand for gasoline. Meanwhile, in the late 1920s, more oil fields are being discovered around the world. They cannot make this stuff at a competitive price. They can't get the price down below the international price, so they therefore can't climb this mountain. But Adolf Hitler comes into office in January 1933, and I outlined for you before what they are prepared to offer if you can produce things out of domestic raw materials. Remember, 5% guaranteed profit. We'll buy everything you have, amortize the firms over 10 years, and in fact, we'll buy more than what you have. We'll pay for you to grow. Now, for the leaders of IG Farben, this is salvation. They have been behaving like this because that's their inherited economic practice. And along comes these people they didn't trust and they didn't expect to be good for them, and these people, within 12 months of Hitler coming into power, offer them the way out of that impasse. And by offering them the way out of the impasse, they mean the cycle will keep going, you will get here, and you can have the money to invest in the next thing that you know is coming. What's that? Synthetic rubber from German coal. And it so happens, of course, that, remember, militarized Keynesianism? It so happens that fuel and rubber are things that the regime desperately wants in order to arm the Wehrmacht and in order to prepare the conquest of Europe. So the interests of the firm and the state dovetail in a way that the firm had not expected. And suddenly you have a company that is increasingly willing to sell everything it has to the state, and then it becomes utterly dependent on the state, monopsony. Then its ability to say no to the state greatly declines. Now, in the case of IG Farben, this story ends, of course, at Auschwitz, because Auschwitz is a factory to produce this. And when it comes the time in 1941 to expand German production of synthetic rubber, the government tells IG Farben, we need a third big factory. And the IG Farben says, well, the economical way to build a third factory to make this stuff is to expand the existing factories that we have. One of which is in Hüls, which is along the Rhineland up near Cologne, and one of which is in Ludwigshafen, which is in the Rhineland, not far from Mannheim or Frankfurt. Now you can, some of you who have maps in your head, immediately see the disadvantage of that. Because both Ludwigshafen and Hüls can be easily hit by British bombers, going back and forth. I mean, it's the westernmost part of Germany. You can build a new factory, but they can destroy it rapidly. And so the managers of the government with whom IG Farben is negotiating, they say, no, you have to build that in the east. Now, as it happened, if you have, well, no, I don't want to do that to you. Imagine a map of Germany, if you can. In those days, Germany had a kind of foot which sticking out to the east, which is now in Poland. And that is called Silesia. It is where the Auschwitz camp was located, at the very tip of Silesia. Gleiwitz is a little short of that, but also far east in Silesia. Why does this matter? Because throughout the Second World War, this part and East Prussia up in the north were about the only parts of the country that British bombers couldn't reach. The policymakers in Berlin called Silesia the Reichsluftschutzbunker, the National Air Raid Shelter. And so, when it comes to build the third factory, and IG Farben says, well, let's build it, it's economical and cheap to build it here, and that'll be the most efficient, the leaders of the Reich say, no, it has to be built where it can't be bombed. Now, this is also an area where there's almost no domestic labor force left. Almost all of the men between 15 and 60 have been called up to the military, but there is a concentration camp. There is a large population of prisoners. And so basically the condition is you will build there, and then IG Farben says, well, we'll try to import workers from the West and so on and so forth, but it won't be quite enough. And then the deal is made that the deficiency in the labor force will be made up with slave laborer inmates of the camp. And IG Farben is absolutely, the leaders of the company see themselves as with no maneuvering room. We are producing this indispensable product. If we don't produce it, they'll probably nationalize it, or they'll give the formulas, which they can do. They can seize them for national defense reasons. They'll give the formulas to a competitor, and so they make the decision to do this. And then, this is what's really diabolical. And then you find themselves trying to rationalize what they have done. And so they say to themselves, you know, we're doing this for the good of the firm, for the future of the stakeholders in the firm, the workers, the people who've invested, so on and so forth. But they also begin to talk anti-Semitic talk. Because they look for justifications for what they've done, and the regime is supplying them with an ideological justification, and they begin to echo it. And I can see this particularly in a man named Fritz Gajewski, who was a plant manager of an AGFA plant outside of Berlin. And in the early 30s, I won't take you through the details, but in the early 30s, he actually stands up to the Nazis in the plant who want him to fire all the Jewish managers. And he basically says, no, I won't do that. You know, this is my factory, I'm responsible for making it work, I'm in charge here, you can't tell me what to do, and I won't fire them. 1943, he's managing a factory that makes synthetic fuel for them, and he's an enthusiastic proponent of using these people. And of course, the difference is, from what he articulates, the difference is he was defending German Jews in 1933. He thought they were people like himself. He'd worked with them for years. They were known to him. They spoke his language. By 1943, he's referring to these people as dirt because they're Eastern European Jews, they don't speak German, they have been put through the ghettos in which they have been dehumanized in many ways. And this is the process of corruption that takes place. But it starts economically. It starts with the mentality that these people have, that they're business people, they're trying to operate. Circumstances change, they adapt. So what happens with Degussa in this? Here it's very different. It's somewhat different because they're not a company that is a big R&D company that lives from these product cycles. They're a niche firm. They do small things. They do processing precious metals. They do inorganic chemicals, cyanides, metals that are potassium and so forth. And that led to their biggest source of income. Everybody knows what Tide is, right, in this country. The German equivalent of Tide is a product called Persil. Persil is the whitener, the thing that you do the diapers in, and so on and so forth, right? This has been the dominant detergent in Germany for 100 years. The key ingredient to Persil is sodium perborate, which is a kind of oxidizer. And Degussa made sodium perborate. It was the source of half their profits in the 1920s. They also made, so the precious metals, they made chemicals extracted from wood, turpentine, for instance, things like that. In the 1920s, they realized that the growth prospects for all of this were very limited. Precious metals was a lucrative business, but it didn't change much from year to year. Turpentine used to be made from wood, but it was in the process of being replaced. Now it's all made in chemical laboratories, synthesis. They knew that part of the business was going to decline. Persil was a surefire profit maker, but what if the company that actually made Persil decided one morning it didn't need to buy the sodium perborate from Degussa anymore, it could make it itself? That would be the end of the company. So in 1928, the head of the managing board at Degussa, a man named Ernst Busemann, decided he was going to take the huge returns on perborate. Because even during the Depression, people still have to wash diapers. So it was what you would think of as depression-proof. The product kept making money. Degussa paid dividends all through the Depression. So Busemann decided, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to take these profits, and we're going to diversify. We're going to spread out into other things that will protect our profits in the future. As it happens, they choose to buy up a couple of little companies, one of which makes waterproof canvas. Okay? Not a big market in 1930, but when the German army starts expanding and needing tents day after day, suddenly it bursts. It's a great profit maker. They also bought up a carbon black factory. And they didn't know when they bought it up in 1930 that it was going to dovetail with this and with the rearmament drive, but then it does. And so by 1936, Degussa's diversification strategy has meshed with the Nazi armament program so that it spreads and succeeds by virtue of the state demand. And then there's one additional element. If Degussa is going to grow by buying up firms, wasn't it lucky for Degussa that the Third Reich decided that Jews should not own factories? Because then suddenly all these buying opportunities appear. And they appear almost the minute the Nazis come in, because the Nazis are determined to get Jews out of the ownership or the management of companies that supply the army. And they go right away in 1933, they go after a company called De Gea, or the Auergesellschaft. And the reason why this company will mean something to Americans is the family that owned the Auergesellschaft was named Koppel, as in Ted Koppel. And they were baptized Jews. They had, the father in the company had converted at the beginning of the 20th century. The one who inherited the company in 1931, who is, I believe, Ted Koppel's uncle, but maybe his grandfather, was a Protestant, but in Nazi eyes was still a Jew. And they went after the Auergesellschaft right away in 1933. The Auergesellschaft had done business with Degussa in the past, so the man Koppel, who owned the Auergesellschaft, went to Busemann and said, would you be interested in buying maybe, 51% of the shares so we look like we're not a Jewish-owned company anymore. And this is how it started. And Degussa then embarked, they bought no fewer than 25 different companies or patents or pieces of real estate that belonged to Jews who were forced to sell out in this fashion. And you see how much growth comes from that? They actually spent on these purchases, and all of the prices were knocked down. They spent on these purchases, listen carefully, more than their total capitalization when they started. That is, they spent more than their total stock was worth in 1932. So they more than doubled their size through the acquisition of Jewish property. Again, this is the corruption of, they had a strategy. The strategy is there before the Nazis come in. The Nazis come in and the strategy works even better. And they begin to fall into this trap of monopsony and feeling that, well, after all, the Third Reich was good for business. And then that paves their road to Gleiwitz, just as with I.G. Farben, this process had paved the road to Auschwitz. What you get at the end, sadly, is after the war, and I can give you some statistics, but just to give you a sense, the Degussa grew between 1933 and 1945 fourfold. And when it was reevaluated in 1949, because the German currency was going to change, when it was reevaluated in 1949, Degussa's own managers calculated that it was 3 times wealthier as a company than it had been in 1925, even if you subtract the bomb damage. And in the case of I.G. Farben, the growth was threefold. So these managers after the war, when it was all done, they basically looked at their workforce and their shareholders and said, see, we did the right thing. We got us through all that horror, and we're better off now than we were then. The price of this was the same thing as the price had been back in 1933, abandoning the Jews. Because in 1933, what these companies had done is basically begin dismissing their Jewish personnel, not overnight, but they began dismissing them. The Gajewski case that I told you about was a rare exception. And they do this in order to take the political heat off so that they can prosper economically. And then after 1945, what they do is they say, none of that's true. We didn't do that. Or they made us do it. This was basically the story. They made us do it, but we didn't. And this is the most poignant example of this is in the case of Degussa. I found this record where the Belgian government inquired in 1948 about what had so after the war, what had happened to gold that was stolen from the Belgian National Bank. And in the process, they raised some questions about gold that had been stolen or had been obtained from concentration camps. And the managers of Degussa write back, bold-faced, without batting an eye, we never got any gold from concentration camps. We never processed anything like that. We had nothing to do with that. And years later, I discovered in the archive this stunning diary that a, oh God, what's the word in German? In German, the word's Praktikant. What's no, what was Monica Lewinsky in the White House? An intern. An intern at the refinery in Reinickendorf, which is a suburb of Berlin, had written in the summer of 1944, exactly at the time when the Łódź ghetto was being liquidated. She wrote about boxes came into the refinery with dental gold, some of them with pieces of gum still attached. Now, her superiors knew what this was, but after the war, they simply bold-faced lied, right? And because we never seized Degussa's archives, we seized the I.G. Farben archives and put those people on trial, right? But we never seized the Degussa archives. Nobody saw this at the time. And Degussa got away for decades, basically saying, we didn't have anything to do with this, while the records of what they had done were sitting right there. Now, I don't want to go on too long, so I'm not going to go on and talk about the banks, but a story like this that I had when I was doing some research on the Dresdner Bank, which was the big bank in Nazi Germany closest to the SS. Years ago, I wrote a letter to the archivist of the Dresdner Bank. I don't even remember what I was specifically asking. But I wrote a letter, and back comes the reply, all of those records were bombed out in World War II. Again, flash forward, come to the 1990s, these class action suits are being launched in the United States. Dresdner Bank got involved in one of those. It decided, like de Gusa, call in a consultant. They got a group of historians to write the history of the Dresdner Bank in the Third Reich. First thing they did is they took these 4 German historians who were supposed to write this to an air raid bunker in Berlin. You know, there are about 5 or 6 of these left. They're gigantic. They're 6, 7 stories tall. You can't blow them up, so they're still there. Brought them to the air raid bunker, opened the doors, and said, here's the archive. And it was, you know, boxes and piles of papers everywhere, none of it cataloged, nothing. These historians, and they had a staff of probably 10 other people who helped them, it took them 2 years just to sort all the archives out. And then they have written 4 volumes of the history of the Dresdner Bank in the Third Reich. But this gives you an idea of the concealment that went on, you know? And for all I know, the archivist who wrote back to me and said they were all bombed out in the war, he might have actually thought that was true, because the leaders of de Gusa knew nothing about their own history at this point, and the leaders of the Dresdner Bank may not have known. But, so this is the story. It's a whole lot more complicated than the notion that the leaders of these companies initially decide to support all of the goals of the Third Reich. There's a process of corruption that takes place, and they are corrupted by their economic interests, but they think they determined those interests. Because after all, the Nazis didn't invent these product cycles. The managers of the company who rose under this invented that. The Nazis didn't invent de Gusa's diversification strategy. The firm had independently arrived at that before the Nazis came in. And so you can see the way in which people almost don't realize what they're doing until they have to. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer questions.
Extra mics on.
Ah.
Switch that on. All right, question and answers.
When you presented the results of your research, how did the company react?
Well, with de Gusa, you know, I made a contract from the very beginning. I wasn't going to go into this with them having any control over what I was going to do. So we signed a contract in advance that they would have no advanced knowledge. I had a board of 6 historical advisors. So when I drafted chapters, I sent them to them, and they would comment and advise me and so forth. And de Gusa didn't get to see it until the manuscript was all done and had been, and I had witnesses. That was what I was doing. I was getting witnesses to what I wrote. And then they were allowed to say to me, I think you should correct page 20 because the name was different from what you say. They were allowed to correct facts or details, and I was allowed to say yes or no to the corrections. But otherwise, that was it. And then what they did, and I think for the managing board, they probably intended to do this all along. They basically, it came out, the results came out, and then they said, well, we're just as shocked as you are. I mean, and I think some of them were quite cynical. I think they thought that there's no subject that is so done as one that is between 2 covers. You know, they thought once it's out in the open, once it's there, somebody can look at it, then they can always point to that and say, well, see, we came clean. And they could rely, or hope they could rely on the fact that no one would read 500 pages in English or 600 pages in German, because that's the way the language is. Everything's longer in German. And they could rely on the fact that people wouldn't read it. And so they, you know, they had done what they thought was a PR move, I think. But I'll say in their defense, I was in, today's Monday, A week ago today, I was sitting in Berlin teaching the middle managers of the company called Evonik, which is the successor to Degussa, teaching the middle managers of this company about what that firm did in the Third Reich. They bring me back every year, voluntarily, to talk to their up-and-coming people, to tell them, this is what happened, and this is what your firm did, this is how they got involved in it, and so that's remarkable. It's all under their training for managers in corporate social responsibility. So nobody associated with IG Farben does that, but Degussa does.
Obviously, the times from 1932 to 38 aren't what we are now, but these were public companies. What did the rest of the world say? Because they were making products that were fixed for war, as you described.
Yeah, but they're mostly dual-use products, and that, of course, obscures the issue because you can make fuel to power tanks or to power personal cars. You can make rubber for the tires on personal cars or the treads on the tanks, and so a lot of this stuff is dual-use. Zyklon is the classic dual-use product. 1% of the Zyklon manufactured between 1941 and 1945 was used to kill people. 1%. 99. Well, Zyklon is a fumigant. It's a pesticide. So it was used to delouse barracks, U-boats, hospitals, any kind of place where you want it. It was also used to tobacco barns, to kill vermin in agricultural things and so forth. That's what it was invented for in 1922. So there was a little bit of deniability in that. And then the other thing about the 1930s that is different from our era is there was this notion that you don't interfere in the internal affairs of another country, however brutal those are. So the kind of pressure that was put on the South African government with apartheid was not put on the Nazis. And besides, there were the appeasers who wanted to avoid conflict with Germany, and therefore they said, we have bigger fish to fry, we're going to keep out of war. It's terrible what they're doing to the Jews, but we're not going to intervene in that, and we're not going to open our borders very much to help people get away. And that was virtually no foreign company with investments in Germany sold out in the 1930s. And one reason for that was you couldn't repatriate the gains because currency controls were so tight that if Ford had sold its factory in Cologne, then the money would have had to stay in Germany. And what would it do with that money? Probably go into government bonds, which would have been funding rearmament anyway. So that was the vicious circle.
Who was the architect of German economic policy?
It changes from year to year. The policy basically is governed by, in the early stages, by a couple of Nazi economic figures, Otto Wagner and so forth, but then it becomes Hjalmar Schacht. And he's the decisive figure from late 33 to 1937, when he is sidelined and then ultimately fired. And then the decisive economic figure is Hermann Göring, but he's dependent on people around him, all of whom are Nazi ideologues. Paul Pleiger, Hans Kerl, and these are people who mostly were in the 20s, people who owned small industries and who were deeply devoted to the program of autarky and armament and expansion.
How much of these archives today are available electronically? And is your report available electronically?
Is mine?
The report that you did, is it?
Well, the dissertation is published as a book and is still available on Amazon, and the book on Degussa is available on Amazon. Electronically, I don't think either of those have an online version or even a Kindle version. But they are available, they're in libraries, they're all over the place. The Degussa thing is interesting. The archive is, I believe, accessible. It was moved from Frankfurt, where I used it, to Hanau, because Degussa was absorbed by another firm and so on. And I believe that you can get some of that material electronically, but not all of it. One of the conditions of my doing this was the archive had to be open. So if you go to Hanau, you can go see it. You can get in. And if you email me, I can tell you who to contact. I mean,
About a year ago, I'm not sure exactly, we had a speaker in here who talked about IBM involvement in the concentration camps and the data processing. Did this come up? Did you come across other companies, American companies that were so involved?
okay, here we go. No. Edwin Black has written this book about IBM and the Holocaust. And it's a book that actually has, you can't tell from reading it, but it's a book that actually has two parts. One part is very well substantiated from the IBM records. And that part tells you that IBM subsidiaries in Europe, and in Switzerland in particular, and in New York, the headquarters, were willing to work with bad people in Nazi Europe, and were willing to remain in business as best they could and do the Romanian census and so on and so forth. That part of the book is well substantiated. It's true. The parts of the book that have to do with the Holocaust, and here I have to choose my words very carefully. Parts of the book that have to do with the Holocaust are simply not true. And let me try to explain that to you in an easy way, or a straightforward way. The first is this. Edwin Black says he started researching on IBM and the Holocaust because there was this question. How did the Nazis get the names of the Jews? And it's a question that begins with Germany. How did they get the names and the addresses of the Jews? And his conclusion is they got it from census data, which was compiled by IBM. The German phrase for this is reinster Quatsch, absolute nonsense. The Nazis began to compile, in Berlin, in Germany, began to compile lists of the German Jews, almost from the minute they took power in 1933. They compiled the lists locally because there's two things in Germany that were required. You have to register at the Standesamt, which is a city clerk's office. And you have to be recorded in the Finanzamt, which is the local tax office. Everybody in Germany has this. Even when I have lived there as a student, I must anmelden, I have to go to the Standesamt and announce, here's my address and here's where I'm living, and when I leave, I have to tell them I'm gone. They always know where everybody is. Now, in 1933, they began using the Finanzamt records, the local records in municipalities, because in Germany, part of your taxes goes to support your denomination. And so the tax officers know whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, or nothing. So they had this already, and so at the local level, they begin compiling it. By 1935, the registration of Jews in Germany was compulsory, and they had to belong to something called the Reichsvertretung, the national representation of German Jews. The Reichsvertretung kept a card catalog of all Jews in Germany. And the finance offices, the tax offices locally, were required to report to that central catalog when any address change took place. Okay? Every few weeks, they had to turn in changes. This means there's a national, like an old-fashioned library card catalog that exists. And what the Nazis did is they just made that, they took it over. They basically made the Reichsvertretung hand that thing to the Gestapo. So the question of how did they get the names and the addresses, they got them from the Jews themselves, and the Jews themselves began cooperating in the 30s because they had no idea where this was going. How could they possibly know that this was a list that was going to eventually be used to round people up and send them away? So, and then in 1939, there's the census. And the census records where Jews are in Germany, but the census isn't counted until 1942. And in the meantime, most Jews living in Germany had to move because they were moved out of their houses, if they were still in them, into Judenhäuser, Jew houses, where they were kept multiple people to a room and so forth. The census became out of date almost instantly. The thing that did not become out of date was the card catalog that the Reichsvertretung and later the Reichsvereinigung was compiling. And we know, because there are survivors, the last one of whom I talked to was involved with this was living in Galveston. We know that when the Gestapo decided to begin the deportations from Berlin, what it did is it sent over to the Jewish organization across town the criteria for the people who were going to be deported the next time. Old people over 65, let's say, or whatever. And then the people in the Jewish administration would pull those cards and would send a list to the Gestapo. Here are all the people who fit that qualification. And the Gestapo would pick the people off the list to coincide with the number of people on the train that it had forecast. No IBM. Now imagine when you go into Eastern Europe. The Einsatzgruppen don't ask, they don't identify people by name. They come into a Ukrainian village and they say all the Jews should assemble here in the market square tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And they have the Jews in the market square, and then they say to the local non-Jews, anybody missing? Let's go look through the houses. And remember, you're assembling there on pain of death. If you don't show up, they tell you they're going to kill you. So most people show up because they don't know what's going to happen. There's no lists, there's no IBM machines, there's no nothing. When the deportations come from Amsterdam, they're done by the local Jewish council. When the deportations are done from Warsaw, from the Warsaw Ghetto, when the Nazis say 6,000 people a day at 4 o'clock every afternoon in the Appellplatz, it's the council that collects these people. There's no naming, there's no use of cards, there's not. So this is Unsinn. This is just, and we know all of this because the people, the Jews who were part of this process left accounts after the war telling how they had done this. So now the second part of this association that Black claims with the Holocaust is he claims that that IBM machines, they were called Hollerith machines in Germany, they were used to allocate slave labor late in the war, to send people from concentration camps to factories and back. We do know that there was an attempt to do that. There were at various concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, so forth, Auschwitz too, there are cards that fit these machines that were collected, and they're stamped on them. They say Hollerith erfasst. That means they've been entered into the Hollerith system. But we also know that they gave up. They couldn't make it work. It was a pilot program that lasted a month or two, and that was that. And he makes that into, so what he's done is he's generalized very small things into very large things. And IBM's role in the Holocaust is virtually nil.
I think we take one more question, short.
One question to that. I've read that Henry Ford shipped thousands of dollars in cash to Hitler in the Nazi Party in the 20s. We know later on Messerschmitt, BMW, when the Wehrmacht was training in Russia, that had to cost money. So which industrialists do we know helped fund the Nazi Party in the 1920s?
The one we know, American or foreigners, you mean, or Germans?
All of them.
I mean,
we
well,
know.
the thing about Ford is we suspect this, but you know, these people are very good at hiding the money trail, so we're not 100% sure of that. What you referred to, the Black Reichswehr, with the training in Russia and so forth, that was largely funded by a trade agreement between the Soviets and Germany. So the money for that kind of went under the table between the two parties. Now, in the early, as Hitler's coming to power, we know that Fritz Thyssen, there's still a company called ThyssenKrupp, which makes escalators and so on. Fritz Thyssen was an avid supporter of Hitler. But there are two powerful leaders of the Commerzbank, which then was the third biggest bank in Germany. Now it's the second. They were advocates of appointing Hitler. They signed a petition to Hindenburg saying, and they gave money. But most of the very top industrialists tended to mistrust him. They tended to think that he's not one of us. He doesn't understand us. He is an uneducated, plebeian kind of character, and so they kept their distance. Now, after the minute he comes into power, the spigot opens. The money starts to flow. And so people who haven't given to him before January 30th, in the spring election campaign, they provide him with something like 3 million Reichsmarks, as I remember. There's a big meeting in the Reichstag on February 20th, 1933, in the president of the Reichstag's palace. 23 industrialists are there. Schacht and Goering, Hitler gives a speech. Schacht and Goering say, pony up, give us the money. They promise 3 million Reichsmarks, and then it increases every year thereafter. Then the contributions become compulsory. Then there's basically a thing called the Adolf Hitler Spende, the Adolf Hitler donation of the German economy, and that meant that every company gave a percentage of their sales, their Umsatz, to the Nazi Party every year. Like a tax. Yeah. Yeah.
Please join me in
Thank you.
thanking our